Welcome to the Hughes Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practice Group's podcast, All Things Investigations. The Hughes Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practices Group represents many of the premier companies around the world, providing advice on issues spanning the full anti-corruption and compliance spectrum. In this podcast, host Tom Fox and members of the Hughes Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Practice Group will highlight some of the key legal issues involved in white-collar and other investigations, both domestically and internationally. We will tackle topical issues involved in investigations, as well as explore how companies can prevent and detect issues that arise in conducting investigations on a worldwide basis. Today we're back with a special two-part podcast series featuring Jeff Nielsen and John Dunin-Wasowicz, partner at Hughes Hubbard & Reed, where we take a deep dive into the EU Directive on the Harmonization of Criminal Sanctions. I know you'll enjoy this part two of a special two-part episode on trade controls and economic sanctions from the EU perspective. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode of All Things Investigations. I'm absolutely thrilled today as we have double trouble. Jeff Nielsen and Jan Dunin-Wasowicz, or thereabouts. And we're going to talk about some trade sanctions, but really look at it from a much broader than simply U.S. perspective. So, gentlemen, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking time to visit with me today.
Glad to be here.
Pleasure to be with you.
Jeff, as our guest, could you introduce yourself to our audience?
My name is Jeff Nielsen. I'm as you can tell, an American lawyer, though I'm sitting here in Copenhagen, Denmark. I practiced U.S. sanctions and European Union sanctions and export controls in the States for several years before moving to Denmark back in around 2013. Since then, I was at law firms, and since then I've been in-house here in Denmark at financial institutions, working in the shipping industry, and now I'm at a large Danish engineering firm, dealing with both U.S. and, as I mentioned, European Union sanctions and export controls.
And Jan, could you reintroduce yourself to our audience, having been on the pod before?
I'm Jan Dunin-Wasowicz. I'm a partner at Hughes Hubbard & Reed, where I am the co-chair of the firm's sanctions, export controls, and AML practice group. Operate out of the Paris office, but with a global practice.
Gentlemen, I'd like to focus to the EU Directive on Harmonization of Criminal Sanctions. And could I start with the basic question is, what is this directive?
Jan, give it a shot.
All right, I'll give it a shot. And so I'll start with the basics, right? And then Jeff has introduced the landscape from an EU perspective. But that's very important to keep in mind, especially now if we're going to talk about the criminal law aspects of this, right? So you have the European Union, 27 member states, and there is a little bit of a split in terms of who does what. There is, on the one hand, the process that the member states and the institutions follow to design and to adopt the sanctions, right? So the principle is that all 27 member states must agree to adopt legislation that we will just reference as the EU sanctions. Now, when that's done, that becomes EU law. Right. So in a way, it's very centralized. It's centralized in terms of the output, right? It's decentralized in terms that you have all the 27 member states that need to agree. So it's not done independently or autonomously at the EU level, but it's the common law, right? It's a common source of law, and we have the same regulations that apply across the 27 member states. Now, once you turn to the question of implementation, and Jeff has touched on that already, you have to go back to the member states, and each of the 27 member states is responsible for implementing or making sure that the sanctions are appropriately implemented in their jurisdiction. Now, you can implement through different means, right? The starting point is compliance, and the hope is that you follow the rules, of course, but sometimes that's not enough, and you need to, as an enforcing authority, you need to take action through investigations, prosecutions, and so on. The legal framework in which a member state does that varies from one member state to one member state. The rules on investigating and prosecuting violations or possible violations of EU sanctions in Germany are not the same as those in Spain, and they're not the same as those in Lithuania, and they're not the same as those in Greece. And I think when the 2022 period, as the EU was adopting more and more measures and adding these layers of sanctions and restrictions, the policymakers at the EU and member state levels also realized that, well, for these sanctions to fulfill their intended purpose, they need to be appropriately implemented, and they may also need to be appropriately enforced. They started thinking about this problem that, well, if you look at the 27 member states, you don't really have a common framework, and that creates a number of issues, which I think we'll talk about. And so you needed to do something about that. And the solution that was proposed was to say, maybe we don't need to do everything the same way in all of the 27 member states when it comes to investigating and prosecuting violations of EU sanctions. However, there should be a common baseline. And the common baseline is that it must be that in all of the 27 member states, this should be a criminal offense, right? And you'll say, what do you mean? Does that mean in some member states it's not even a criminal offense? Yes, that's the case today. In some member states, it's not a criminal offense. And that creates forum shopping problems. It distorts competition. So I think that's the starting point. And the starting point was, let's agree on a list of criminal offenses, minimal penalties, and other things that the EU will push through a directive. So a directive means that has to be implemented in the 27 legal systems, but the member states can go beyond that, right? But it's the minimum that has to be done to be compliant from a member state perspective with EU law.
So what are some of the challenges you guys see down the roads? We have a baseline. Does that mean we'll have some member states that may be more aggressive? Does that mean, I was really interested in your earlier comments, I think, Jeff, that we have member states who actually compete against each other economically. So they may have other factors or other issues as opposed to the United States, where hopefully in the trade sanctions arena, we speak with one voice through the federal government. How do you see those challenges at this point?
I mean, it's going to require good faith on the part of the member states. Meeting these minimum standards that Jan described. As he pointed out, this is a directive, meaning that a directive is simply nothing more than an instruction from the European Union to the member states saying, do this at minimum. The directive leaves a lot to still be desired. Although, as Jan has pointed out, we both believe this is a great first step. There are a few themes, though, that are really important to be conscious of in the year 2, 3, 4 out. By the way, the member states have 1 year to meet the requirements of this directive. Notably, the directive does not deal with civil enforcement. And as we all know, in the States, there's both a civil enforcement regime governed by OFAC or run by OFAC, and a criminal enforcement regime run by the Department of Justice for sanctions violations, intentional violations. This directive only touches on criminal enforcement in Europe. And in Europe, there are 12 member states that have only criminal regimes. Denmark, where I sit, is one of those. We have no civil enforcement sanctions here. There are 13 member states that have both civil and criminal, so a similar system similar to the US. And 2, Spain and Slovakia, have currently only civil enforcement. So while harmonization in this regard is an admirable first step, we know that criminal enforcement is much less common than civil enforcement because of the resources that must be allocated to enforce a criminal case. So this is not going to cut into a lot of the more common violations that, for example, OFAC deals with. In addition to that, a critical dimension of the directive is that the directive only, as Jan described, sets minimum standards. It does not require that member states actually enforce. It just requires that member states set minimum rules for what amounts to a sanctions violation criminally and what the penalties are going to look like. There are no, so to speak, in the directive that require member states to enforce. There are reporting and coordination frameworks that are to be set up, but there's no requirement in the directive. And of course, I think last and critically, where the devil is in the details, is in that, and I think Jan touched on this, every member state has its own prosecutorial bureaucracy and its own jurisprudential system. Evidentiary standards are different. The right of a prosecutor to defer prosecution, or we call engage in prosecutorial discretion, varies from member state to member state. Of course, standards for appeal and other requirements related to moving a case through the system vary member state by member state. The directive is silent on those as well. It can't speak to them because of the limits of the treaties. So there's three things there that I think are going to be large challenges for implementation of this directive such that it becomes effective.
And I would perhaps just add, hopefully, that this directive will prompt debates and discussions and review in the 27, or I should say 26, right? Because I think there's one or two member states that are opted out of this. Yeah. It should, because there's this deadline of, there's essentially 1 year to make sure that the requirements of the directive are complied with. It should prompt the member states to assess if their legal framework meets these criteria, and if they need to change something in their legal framework, what changes should be introduced. And so it'll be very interesting to see to map out a little bit the enforcement framework in a year or so and see where we are. I also think it's interesting that the choice was made to go with the directive, so essentially to enhance the enforcement frameworks at the member state level. One can understand why that choice was made. In sanctions, you have really the two areas that traditionally are really with the member states: foreign policy and criminal law. So in a way, you'd think that should be dealt in the member states. At the same time, many of these issues are EU issues, right? And there is an interesting question of whether this enforcement framework shouldn't be transferred to the EU level, either with the European Public Prosecutor's Office or on the civil and administrative side with the European Commission. And I think that's probably one path to seriously explore, but it would prompt major changes, possibly in the treaty, that this is not something that could happen overnight, obviously. But I don't think we should completely rule it out. I think there's some ideas that are being proposed, and it'll be interesting to see, I think, a year from now where we are.
Gentlemen, I'm going to end with two questions. And I'm going to direct the first one to Jan, and Jeff, if you want to jump in, certainly do. But the second one is going to be directed to you, Jeff. Jan, the first question is, I was going to ask you what's down the road for trade sanctions, but I want to expand that a little bit to things, other factors, such as how the EU views the Russian invasion of Ukraine, perhaps a little differently than America does, because literally you're sitting on the frontier. What things might look like if there's a peace treaty, a solution, or an end to the conflict. And let me just lay on, where do you see all this in 2030? Jeff, I was really intrigued by your comments about sort of the state of the profession, and if someone is in college or graduate school or law school, how they might gravitate to a trade sanction compliance, and really have you talk about how does someone get into this as the next generation of trade sanction experts, and how they can navigate things that like I fell into compliance and you got into compliance not intentionally. So those are going to be the two ending questions. So Jan, I know I've given you a lot in there, but where do you see all of this going in 2030 and perhaps even beyond?
It's a very tough question, Tom, and I think it would be somewhat imprudent of me to even try answering the 2030 question. Just if we reflect on the fact that in 2014, when the invasion of Ukraine in fact started with the illegal annexation of Crimea, I don't think many people in Europe would have foreseen the situation we are in today, 10 years into it. So I think unfortunately, looking at the situation as it is today, I think we will have more sanctions before we have less sanctions. I think these sanctions are here to stay. I think we're looking at a while, but at some time living under the sanctions. Hopefully, if the military hostilities would cease, I also think that and I'm obviously speculating, but I doubt these sanctions would completely be lifted, all of them at once. It would probably be a sequence in lifting them. So, but unfortunately, looking at the situation today, it's a scenario that is very difficult to see. I think we're in for the long run here, Jeff. So I can't, I don't know where we'll be in 2030, but I know also that, or I believe I should say that it's a real challenge for the EU. I think all of this is actually, it's quite fragile. It does require a lot of effort and a lot of support. And so depending on who is in the various member states and where the process goes and where the politicians are and what they're doing, we may have a very different picture. So I still believe in the sanctions. I think we need to push them, but I think they're the last thing we have before very dramatic things.
Jeff.
Yeah. So as I understand the question was, what does someone who wants to get into our field do? I understand that correctly. As Jan was thinking, I was thinking of a few things. First, going back to what we touched on earlier, I think that before somebody, depends on the career you want to go into. Do you want to be a compliance professional or compliance officer or a lawyer? But I think the first step for anybody who wants to go into this field, whether you go on either or proceed with either of those two tracks, is spend time understanding foreign policy. A lot of time. Preferably someone who's listening to this podcast is currently in college, so they're young enough to do that. But I don't think that anything that I'm capable of doing, I would have been so had I not spent a lot of time studying foreign policy. Second, spend time understanding the history of sanctions. These measures are things that go way back in history, back as far as many have recorded the Peloponnesian Wars themselves. Understand the nature of using trade as one can say, weapon or a tool of foreign policy. Understand how it's happened and evolved over the years. There's some great books in this regard that I've read during my nascent years. And then third, as if you're younger, get a mentor. Jan and I both, I know, mentor several people. We're both on LinkedIn, so I can't offer Jan as a volunteer, but if folks want to contact me on LinkedIn, feel free to do so. I currently mentor several people in this field who are very young, both here in Denmark and then last, spend time under the tutelage working for somebody in a work environment who's really good at this. Whether they're a mentor or a boss, but spend that time. Don't just jump in with both feet and try to become an expert in your own. This is a very complex field. It's constantly changing. It's very dynamic. So spend time learning from somebody who understands where the bodies are buried, so to speak, and how to take an understanding of the field and proceed with it as things continue to change.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. I wanted to thank you both again for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely.
Pleasure.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this part 2 of this special 2-part podcast series where we looked at economic sanctions and trade controls in the EU and from the European perspective. I hope you will join us again for our next episode of All Things Investigations, and that you will subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. The award-winning All Things Investigations is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the award-winning All Things Investigation. We've linked to the Hughes Hubbard website in our show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. I hope you will join us again for our next episode of All Things Investigations. All Things Investigations is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.